In a shocking turn of events, a respected lawyer and member of a prominent family would be exposed as a ruthless killer, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. The case of Alex Murdaugh, a man from a long line of esteemed attorneys in South Carolina, is a complex web of deceit, greed, and murder. Alex's family had been a part of the legal landscape in the small town of Hampton for over a century, with his great-grandfather and grandfather both serving as solicitors. This legacy of power and influence would eventually contribute to the sense of entitlement that seemed to drive Alex's actions. The Murdaugh family was well respected and well connected, with a reputation for being fair and just. However, behind the facade of respectability, a different story was unfolding. Alex's wife, Maggie, was a beautiful and charming woman, loved by everyone who knew her. She was a devoted mother to their two sons, Buster and Paul. The family lived on a sprawling estate in Islandton, surrounded by the beauty of nature. The relationship between Alex and his family was complex, with some describing it as close but also distant. Alex's father, Randolph, was a dominant figure in the family, and his expectations of his son were high. Alex's mother, Elizabeth, was a kind and gentle soul, who always tried to keep the peace. The family's dynamics were further complicated by the fact that Alex's brother, Randy, was also a lawyer, and the two brothers often found themselves on opposite sides of the law. As the years went by, Alex's behavior became increasingly erratic, and his addiction to opioids began to take a toll on his family life. Despite this, the family presented a united front to the world, and their reputation in the community remained intact. However, the cracks were beginning to show, and it would only be a matter of time before the truth came to light. The town of Hampton was a small, tight-knit community, where everyone knew each other's business. The Murdaugh family was an integral part of this community, and their reputation was built on trust and respect. However, as Alex's behavior became more and more erratic, the people around him began to notice a change. His colleagues at the law firm where he worked started to suspect that something was wrong, but they could never have imagined the extent of his deceit. The family's estate, where the tragic events would eventually unfold, was a beautiful and peaceful place, surrounded by nature and filled with memories of happy times. It was here that Alex's wife, Maggie, and their youngest son, Paul, would meet their untimely deaths. On the night of June 7, 2021, Alex Murdaugh's life would change forever. He had been struggling with addiction and financial problems, and the pressure was building. In a desperate bid to cover his tracks and avoid financial ruin, Alex would commit a heinous crime, one that would shock the community to its core. The events of that night are still unclear, but it is known that Alex shot and killed his wife and son, before calling 911 to report the incident. The police would later find the bodies of Maggie and Paul near the dog kennels on the family's estate, with multiple gunshot wounds. The investigation that followed would be one of the most complex and high-profile in the state's history. As the news of the murders spread, the community was left reeling, trying to make sense of the senseless tragedy that had occurred. The police investigation into the murders was thorough and meticulous, with investigators leaving no stone unturned. They began by interviewing Alex, who claimed that he had been visiting his mother at the time of the shooting, and had only returned to the estate to find the bodies. However, as the investigators dug deeper, they found inconsistencies in Alex's alibi, and his story began to unravel. The police also discovered that Alex had been facing significant financial difficulties, and that he stood to gain a large sum of money from his wife's death. This motive, combined with the evidence found at the crime scene, would eventually lead the police to suspect that Alex was involved in the murders. As the investigation continued, the police found a trail of evidence that pointed to Alex's guilt, including a suspicious conversation with his father, and a series of contradictory statements. The case against Alex was building, and it would only be a matter of time before he was charged with the crime. The trial of Alex Murdaugh was a dramatic and intense affair, with the prosecution presenting a wealth of evidence against him. The key witness for the prosecution was a former colleague of Alex's, who testified that he had been embezzling funds from his law firm to feed his opioid addiction. This testimony, combined with the evidence found at the crime scene, would prove to be devastating for Alex's defense. The prosecution also presented a series of text messages and emails that showed Alex's desperation and panic in the days leading up to the murder. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Alex's defense team was struggling to counter the evidence against him. The prosecution's case was building, and it seemed increasingly likely that Alex would be found guilty. In a last-ditch effort to save his client, Alex's lawyer would try to shift the blame onto someone else, but it was too late. The jury had already made up their minds, and Alex's fate was all but sealed. The verdict in the trial of Alex Murdaugh was guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The reaction in the courtroom was one of shock and relief, as the family and friends of the victims finally got the justice they had been seeking. The community was also left to pick up the pieces, and to try to make sense of the tragedy that had occurred. As the news of the verdict spread, the world was left to wonder how such a tragedy could have occurred, and how a man who had once been so respected and admired could have fallen so far. The case of Alex Murdaugh is a cautionary tale about the dangers of addiction and the corrupting influence of power. It is a reminder that even the most respected and privileged members of society can be capable of terrible things, and that the truth is often hidden behind a mask of respectability. In the aftermath of the trial, the community was left to rebuild and to heal. The Murdaugh family's reputation was in tatters, and the once respected name was now synonymous with tragedy and deceit. The estate where the murders took place was sold, and the family's assets were frozen. Alex's brother, Randy, would later speak out about the tragedy and the devastating impact it had on their family. He would describe the sense of shame and guilt that they all felt, and the struggle to come to terms with what had happened. As for Alex, he would spend the rest of his days behind bars, a shadow of the man he once was. The case of Alex Murdaugh is a reminder that justice can be slow, but it will eventually catch up with those who have committed such heinous crimes. And as we reflect on the events that unfolded, we are left to wonder, what other secrets lie hidden behind the closed doors of privilege and power?